All right, here we go. Welcome back to AP World. We are looking at Ways of the World, Chapter 10, per request. I'm going to walk you through the chapter. Maybe it'll help you understand it better. I'm not sure, but I'll give it a shot. So this is part one because this is a lot more than I thought it would be. So I'm going to go to page 449. So if this is working for you, let me know and I'll do some more. If not, I will not. So I'll leave it there. You can give me some advice on that. So here we go. This is, again, for AP World. Just to remind you, there are 9 units for this class. You can look at this, and I'll go over this with you in class later. But we went through units 1 to 5 through revolutions last semester, and we're picking up the consequences of industrialization, they call it, which is basically how industrialization caused Europeans and Japan primarily to want to branch outward and colonize, take over, exploit, and control many other parts of the world. Although we will be focusing mainly on Asia and Africa for this section. This is also known as the second stage of exploration or imperialism. And so the last two things I'll say are that we have 3 units after this unit, global conflict, which is the wars, and then we're going to wrap up with the Cold War and decolonization and a very simple overview of globalization up to this point before we review for the AP exam. So anyway, let's talk about Chapter 10, Colonial Encounters in Asia and Africa and Oceania, 1750 to 1950. So I'm going to walk you through this. The beginning of the chapter, your textbook in Strayer talks about there was a movement in 2013 in Namibia to remove a German statue. This is the German statue here. It is a soldier, commemorating a soldier who fought from the German perspective at that time valiantly, obviously from the Namibian perspective as a conqueror, a exploiter, and as a person who perpetuated genocide. So this statue was removed in 2013, understandably, by the people of Namibia. And it is just a reminder that there are still debates over the legacy of imperialism today. And we'll actually partake in one of our own discussions about what are the British reparations to India later in class. This is another symbol of British imperialism in India. It is also in your textbook. I recommend you take a look at this. This has to do with the coronation of King Edward VII of England, and this celebration was done in India. This is in 1903, and the Viceroy of India, the Governor of India, is sitting on the elephant in the front, and in the background is an Indian prince. You can see that the British Viceroy has an elephant draped in gold, and the person behind him does not. So let's take a look at this. So the first part of the chapter talks about industry and empire, and it talks about how the Industrial Revolution fueled much of Europe's expansion. This is obvious. If you need raw materials to churn out textiles in your factory, to provide rubber for the belts that run your factory machinery, or the bicycles and the automobiles that are invented later in the second stage of industrialization, you're going to need to go to other places in the world to get these things. This is the expansion of capitalism. This is something that's going to happen, and we're going to see Europeans move in earnest into Africa and Asia primarily. The Americas obviously have already been conquered and gotten their independence in the 1800s, although they will be part of this process of industrialization just the same, just not as much with imperialism. So we see that there's also a growth of nationalism in Europe. This is talked about in the book. Countries like Germany in the 1870s and Italy emerge as independent states. And the leaders recognize that the people will be more supportive of these countries if they colonize other places, because it is sold to the people that a powerful nation has colonies. And so it's looked at as a status symbol. And this is also going to be a big driver for imperialism at this time. They are going to have more steamships, more developments such as quinine, which is a medical advancement that provides some protection from malaria, which is very big in Africa, so that's going to protect them. And then they also have industrial developments such as the breech-loading rifle and early machine guns, which make it easier for Europeans and Japanese later as well, or at the same time, I should say, to conquer their colonial subjects, if you want to say that. Okay, also, as covered in the book, Europeans' perceptions of the, quote, other, that is, the colonized people, started to change during the period of industrialization. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, in the Enlightenment and years before, Europeans looked at other people in the world with a sense of respect. Maybe they weren't the same. There were some things they did not appreciate about their cultures, but they always saw there were things to value, be it an advanced civilization in Africa, the Chinese, and all their cultural achievements and emphasis on scholarship. Japanese Bushido culture and ethics. All these things were very well regarded by Europeans in some circles at least. And during the Industrial Age, it started to change. Basically, Europeans began to view themselves as this advanced civilization that went through the process of the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, and now the Industrial Revolution to demonstrate their superiority through what they considered the ease and facility through which they conquered the Americas in the 15th century and 16th century, up until the rather quick advancements they made in Asia and Africa in the 19th century. They began to look at the Chinese as inferior to them. They looked at the Africans as inferior. Different ideas for different cultures. Some of them are too. It was also wrapped up with sexism, so they might say this is a more feminine race, or this one is a less intellectual race of people. This is where the concept of race emerges in a really significant way in Europe. More than in the past. This is something a lot of you remembered learning about last year in ethnic studies. So I won't really speak too much to that because I think you have a pretty good understanding of how this developed in Europe, the world, and the United States. But this idea that there were like weaker races and Europeans were at the top of that racial hierarchy definitely began to solidify at this time. Some Europeans looked at it as this idea, almost an obligation. They called it the white man's burden a lot of times. Rudyard Kipling wrote a famous poem that carried that title, basically with the idea that it was the burden that white people had, the obligation to go to other places in the world and uplift people, in their words, to make them more European and teach them about European culture, European habits, literature, philosophy, etc., disregarding all the achievements these other places had, forgetting that Europeans had borrowed so much throughout history from other parts of the world, be it Africa, Mesopotamia, the Middle East, and Asia. So we've learned about that in this class many times. They said, no, we are going to make them like us because we are better than they are. But it was a bit of an obligation. That's, some people would say, less problematic. It's still problematic and racist, but even worse in a lot of ways was this idea of scientific racism which developed, which was the idea that they would now use science, because of course they're more scientifically advanced, to prove that Europeans are more advanced than other people. So they did a lot of crazy things like looking at skeletal remains. We talked about this with Scientific Revolution, how they use bogus science to try to point out that women were inferior to men. They do the same thing during this time to show how certain races are different than others. And we know this is totally inaccurate scientifically, but at the time, people accepted it. And people in Europe, that is, some people at least. And so they mingled that sometimes with something even more nefarious, one could argue, which is social Darwinism, the idea that the survival of the fittest, make it really simple, applied to the animal kingdom, could also apply to human beings, and so it only makes sense that the fittest should survive and dominate the less fit races and cultures in the world. So it's very problematic, but it was something that some people subscribed to. And then there is the idea mentioned in your book about going with the white man's burden, also the idea to spread Christianity to parts of the world, which did happen in Africa and other places. And a lot of times, just like we've seen in the past, people are adopting to religions for a variety of reasons, but sometimes it is to solidify their group of people, to protect them from outside forces, maybe from Muslim societies around them. But a lot of people did convert to Christianity in Africa under European colonial rule, and it's a very large Christian continent to this day, two main religions being Islam and Christianity. And the Christian influence, except for Ethiopia, which a lot of Christians in the world forget about, especially ridiculous singers in the 80s who wrote a song asking if people in Africa knew it was Christmas. And this song always drives me nuts when I hear it. And I just think the Ethiopians are thinking, yes, dumbass, of course we know it's Christmas. We are some of the oldest Christians in the world, but that's another story. So basically, this is another wave of Christianity coming to Africa. And so that's another thing that's covered in your book. And the next thing I'll get to, and of course, these are some images that are addressed in your book. This is a kind of an image, kind of the portrayal of Africa needing to be kind of harnessed, controlled, and having Europeans kind of take away power from this sleeping continent that is not using its land wisely. Very similar to how Europeans justified domination in the United States later under Manifest Destiny. And this is the idea of social Darwinism here, or scientific racism, ridiculous image showing evolution of races in a way. Hey, so we're going to look at the second wave of European conquest. So this is going to happen around 1750 to 1914. First wave would be transoceanic connections with the Americas and the Indian Ocean before. This is going to focus on Asia, Africa, and Oceania, which is the South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, those islands there. We got a lot of new countries involved. We got Germany and Italy, newly unified nation states in the late 1800s, 1870s to be exact. We have the United States, Japan, Belgium. All these countries want to expand their influence for industrial and political reasons, just to show your power, your might, to get your people focused less on their own problems of industrialization and more on other things like national pride. We're going to go out and establish colonies in places in Africa and Asia. This is something that the Germans were really tuned into in terms of distracting people from temptations of socialism and stuff like that. So a lot of times Europeans, when they went to a colony, they wanted to have informal control. That was a lot easier. There's a mention in your textbook about French West Africa having just a few hundred French officials ruling over this vast empire with millions of people, simply because that worked for them. They made deals with local leaders. As long as you recognize us as what we would call in political historical parlance your protectorate, you won't make deals with other European powers. You'll trade with us. You'll recognize our influence. You'll allow Christian missionaries to come in. We will let you kind of rule yourselves for us, and the leaders can collect taxes and stuff like that. So there was benefits. Sometimes it was more direct and formal, but a lot of times Europeans preferred the informal control because it was just easier, cheaper, and in some ways allowed them to put their forces and their militaries in other places. So this would lead to conquest a lot of times, I should say conflict between European powers. We'll talk about that. And because of that conflict, sometimes they got more direct in their conquest of colonial regions to beat other Europeans to the area so they can assert control. And this competition is going to eventually be one of the big causes or forces of World War I. So the establishment of second wave European empires was based a lot of times on military force, sometimes just with the threat of using it. And that really kind of went with the Europeans having a lot of firepower advantages over people in other parts of the world. So territories became colonies in a variety of ways. This is discussed in your book. Sometimes they were just groups of people, different what we might call tribal groups today. Pastoralist people who are nomads, people who are farming, people who are kind of incorporated into larger civilizations over time, and they kind of got drawn into this trade system with a network of local leaders who work with Europeans. Sometimes there was an area, say the Mughal Empire and Indian Hindu princely states and what we'd call India today, that allowed economic forces, trading companies like the British East India Company to come in and make deals with them and indirectly have an influence, and then eventually that would turn into direct colonial rule. That was the same thing that the Dutch did with the Dutch East India Company, and the Dutch ended up taking over what we'd call Indonesia today. And ultimately, though, there would be just deliberate conquest in much of Africa, be it through the kind of deceitful trickery of places like the Congo, the Belgians in the Congo, or the French in Vietnam, and the United States in the Philippines. After we, quote, helped the Filipinos get their independence from Spain, we then turned on them, and they resisted and led to the death of upwards of 200,000 Filipinos fighting against American colonization, which would then last until after World War II. So, different ways that people fell under the rule of Europeans, Americans, and the Japanese. There was also a lot of dispute over rule in Oceania and Pacific in particular. Even in South America, Chile got involved, looking for natural resources, of course, and the easternmost kind of Polynesian islands would be what we'd call Easter Island today. And Chile really wanted to have control over that for nitrates and guano, which is bird droppings, which is really good fertilizer. So there's always going to be some economic pull for people to get into the imperial game. And that's a great example of that. In Australia and New Zealand, like in North America, we have these large settler colonies where the indigenous people are killed off through just military force, but also to a larger extent, introduction of diseases, smallpox, etc. Same thing with Hawaii. The United States will take over Hawaii and the indigenous population will dwindle dramatically. This will happen even in Siberia under Russian influence. A lot of places are going to see their indigenous populations decrease, and as Europeans move in, we'll call these settler colonies. So there's a lot of these today. The United States is also going to expand this era, what we call in our history manifest destiny. We used to call it that. Today, of course, people don't like that term because it kind of, in a very bizarre way, argues that this was designed by a higher power, which most of us don't subscribe to anymore. But we did take over a large swath of southwestern America from Mexico through brutal force, through what we call the Mexican-American War. Land I am standing on today is part of that. We also, obviously, before and after that, took land from indigenous people who were already here. I already referenced our annexation of the Philippines. Japan did the same thing. Taiwan and Korea you should remember, those are the two colonies that Japan had. Taiwan also was a colony of China. It was not like, it has its own indigenous people that the Han Chinese then started to take control over, and then the Japanese came in. And for a while, they ruled Taiwan. And they're going to go into Korea as well, and then we'll see them expand greatly after World War I and into World War II. Throughout the South Pacific. Some places did not get colonized, and it is important to remember that. Liberia in Africa is one example because it was set up by a society in the United States, that is a group of people in the 1800s who wanted to establish a place for freed slaves from the United States to go. And they became the colonizing elite of Liberia. It was under sort of the protection of the United States, so European power is not going to try to colonize Liberia. Ethiopia, this great nation that had been around for thousands of years, is able to repel Italian influences in a famous battle, the Battle of Doha. That's an example of successful African resistance to Europeans, primarily because they were able to get weapons and supplies from other European powers. We'll learn about that more in class. And Thailand, or Siam, is a country that, if you look on the map, let me see if I can go over to a map here so you can see, it is between French Indochina and British Burma, so it played off the French and the British quite well. It had a pretty organized, it's also a large country on the interior, not like an island nation, so it's not very porous. It was able to fend off European colonization as well. So there are some examples of that, as we see. In African and Asian societies, there is a wide range of responses, which I talked about. So sometimes it's going to be, I will gladly work with you if I can be one of the elite and I can benefit. But a lot of times people resisted. We saw that again. We'll see that more. There's lots of resistance. I'll talk about more in a little bit. And I just mentioned the resistance of the Ethiopians against Italy in the 1890s. So So let's go back on here. There's Africa. This is going to be kind of a good kind of visual. We'll look at over the scramble of Africa, or the scramble for Africa, which happened between around 1881 and 1914, which is World War I's beginning year. Europeans carved up Africa rather quickly, and they made some deals on how to do that through something called the Berlin Conference, so that they could avoid war. Okay. So it is good to remember that under European rule, there's a lot of trauma. Obviously, it was a terrible experience for many people. Lots of loss of life, massacres, death through disease, just changing social structures. All kinds of problems happened. Some people, however, did cooperate. Again, so they could be the ruling elite to maybe work with the Europeans in a protectorate. They had some sort of economic advantage. Maybe they got power they did not have before. Again, taking on their rivals and other local societies. So there was some cooperation. A lot of times there was the movement for European governments to allow Christian missionaries or even their own government people sent from the government educators to kind of promote European education. They would do that so that they would learn the language, be it French or English or German, and then they would be the colonial elite, which would help them run that society. And that became very common. We'll see that in our little case study with India, for example. And they would even employ indigenous men mostly to be their local soldiers to enforce the rule of law, whatever law that might be. I'm using that word very liberally there in these places. So every once in a while, though, there were rebellions, obviously. Why would there not be? It would be surprising if there weren't. A very famous rebellion would be the Sepoy or Indian Rebellion of 1857 and 1858. We'll talk about that in class. Again, that starts through just basic frustration among the people of India being ruled by an outside power, but it's a rumor related to animal fat being used in the cartridges they use for their guns. That's going to lead to an open rebellion. English people will be killed and massacred. The British East India Company loses control, so the British military has to come in and suppress this rebellion. And then after that, India more or less becomes a very direct colony under British rule, with about 100,000 British bureaucrats kind of running the place with the help of Indian soldiers. And so excuse me, that's something we'll look at more in class, but that's just the gist of it. Let's see, some people in India even wanted to have the Mughal Empire come back, but of course that's fraught with a lot of religious tensions due to the Islamic Hindu divides, and we'll see that the British played to those divisions to make them even worse and exacerbate them, to try to divide people by limiting how they can vote even in local elections based on their religion. And we'll dig into that more in class, so I don't need to worry about that right now. So colonial empires with a difference. So what's going to change here with these colonial empires? One thing is there's a real big obsession with race as the way that they kind of categorize people. So this is where colorism really will be adopted in a lot of societies. The emphasis on lighter skins. It's been around for a while. So this is a big debate you could talk about in your ethnic studies classes. But for sure, they started to classify people based on their race. And, Europeans brought a lot of racial animosity with them. So, and kind of, again, we talked about this idea of Europeans having this sense of racial superiority as a way of doing that. They also were into counting people, and they like to separate them and create groups that maybe the local people did not have before. Maybe they're going to put different groups in Africa into what they start to call tribes. And they'll take the caste system in India, and they'll really develop that as a way, and they'll really become fascinated with that as a way of kind of seeing the divisions in Indian society, and the British will use that to their advantage. So there's a lot of this idea of distinct tribes that the Europeans almost created and invented even in Africa that still exists to this day. There's also a big influence on, I'm going to come back to this picture in a minute, on gender. They look at this idea that they are more masculine than the people that they colonize, and they'll look at the colonized people as more soft and passive, more feminine, and so there's a lot of sexism embedded in this idea of imperialism. And sometimes they'll look at different groups of people, and they will see them as more masculine. So, like maybe the Sikhs or the Gurkhas of India, the Kamba and the Hausa in Africa. They're looking at these people as more masculine, more fighting groups of people, where others are going to be more feminine and less likely to be useful to the Europeans as military support, but also more worthy of European dominance in a way. So basically, this is going to lead to a lot of contradiction in European values, right? Because Europeans, and just like the Americans as well, we are a democratic country. We want people to have self-rule and stuff like that. These are all Enlightenment ideals, but we're doing exactly the opposite. This is what the Europeans, some are saying to themselves and to each other, and that's going to lead to a lot of tension in the way people view this. Not all Europeans or all Americans were excited about this idea of nationalism. I'm sorry, of imperialism, and a lot of times it is borne out through nationalism. This is an image in your book again showing the British official being attended to by servants in India, kind of getting you the sense of the racial divisions that emerged. So we're going to stop here. This is page 449 in your textbook. This is what I would call part one of my little YouTube overview of chapter 10. It's taken me a while to figure out how to do this, so hopefully I'll be able to do part two a lot faster for my own good, and hopefully I'll be able to splice these together for you. Okay, stay tuned for part two.